Hi, all, and thank you for tuning into today's program featuring two wonderful journalists who know their way around Washington, Evan Osnos and Jessica Yellen. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 25th season. We're 5 days away from November 3rd. Evan Osnos' new book, Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now, is a glorious read about a guy whom we've known for oh so many decades. I was at turns reassured, delighted, surprised, and moved by Evan's book. Consider it an extended profile of the sort we love in The New Yorker. Here's a man who's a genius at connecting to his public one-on-one, who lives and breathes genuine and true compassion. On the flip side, we see a Joe Biden who's a brilliant and savvy politician, a tough operator who takes no hostages. And in story after story, we see a man of such great resilience, of such moral certitude and genuine decency. The stories of Biden's star turns during his Obama years seesaw between funny and tragic. And as The Atlantic suggested, perhaps Biden was the most influential vice president in American history. Evan's narrative forms a portrait of a man whose moment with the American people might just be here. And if you have questions during the program, do email us at reservations@writersblocpresents.com, and we'll try to address them. Jessica Yellen knows the White House well, too. She was White House correspondent for ABC News under George W. Bush and was chief White House correspondent for CNN during the first term of the Obama administration. She's the author of the novel Savage News, which is so fun, a satirical takedown of television news, specifically about women. Please visit our website to find a link to Evan's book, Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. And if you like what Writer's Bloc Presents does, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution. Thank you. We are so delighted to present Evan Osnos and Jessica Yellen. I love this program and I'm so excited.
Thank you so much for putting this on, and it is a real treat to be moderating this conversation. I think that Evan Osnos is one of the most exceptional journalists working in America today. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker. His book, The Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, won the 2014 National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His resume goes on and on, but we are here today to talk about his work on this book, the Joe Biden book. Evan, what perfect timing that you're coming out with the Biden book again.
Well, let's just say it wasn't by accident. It took a little bit of planning. I have to say, before we go any further, I do want to say a special thank you to Andrea for having us. This is just like my favorite pairing in the world. And Jessica, thanks to you. You are doing better and more work right now than anybody I know under the sun. So thanks for taking time out. I'm grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great timing because we all want to know more about Joe Biden. And one of the remarkable things about this book is you actually started reporting on Joe Biden at a moment in time where I should fairly say most people were kind of saying goodbye to him. It was toward the end of what we all assumed was his public career. What drew you to this subject?
You know, honestly, I was coming from China, right? I'd spent all these years abroad. I came back to Washington, and I was most interested and sort of most comfortable in the world of foreign affairs. So I said, okay, who's doing foreign affairs? So I sort of, went over and saw Joe Biden because he really was doing stuff of consequence in the White House, partly because, as he liked to joke, Obama sent him to places that Obama didn't want to go. And there was some actual truth to that. I mean, early on in the administration, you remember that Obama basically said, hey, Joe, you do Iraq. And so that's how Biden ended up on the Iraq portfolio. So I started going and seeing Biden and discovered that he was sort of, the honest answer was that even when he tried to spin, he just wasn't very good at it. And that was wonderful from a reporter's perspective, because it meant that you could begin to understand how he really felt about things, what he actually thought. Like when he thought that an ally, for instance, was doing something destructive in one of these places, whether it was in Iraq or Syria, he would tell you that in a way that another kind of politician wouldn't. And I think there's one other piece of it, which you would recognize well, Jessica, which is that, honestly, the vice presidency is the most maligned job in Washington. And so, frankly, sort of more sophisticated reporters, people who had a lot more experience in DC, they weren't going to see Joe Biden. It just didn't feel like he mattered that much. And so for a kind of a newbie, he was actually a good fit for me, and I became kind of a recidivist Biden interviewer. I would go back and do it over and over again because I found it quite informative. I began to understand more about the political culture of Washington through him.
That's interesting. He was kind of a window in for you. I think you wrote your first piece on him. It was 2014. Would you have ever guessed that he would have had a second life after the Obama administration back then?
Honestly, I guess I did. I was sort of surprised in 2016 that he didn't run. And that's partly because, you have these two ingredients that make up who he is, right? There's the part of Joe Biden, as I describe in this book, who talked about running for president on his first date with his late wife. I mean, his late wife, Nelia Hunter's mother, asked this guy who's taking her daughter out, "What do you plan to make of yourself?" And this kind of blustery 20-year-old kid says, "Well, I plan to be president and of the United States," he added sort of helpfully. And then you take that, and it became the defining fact of his sort of orienting imagination. That's how he saw himself in the world. And it's what drove him into public service initially, of course, in the Senate and so on. And then you get later into this administration, and the stars were so clearly aligning against him. The death of his son, Beau, which we'll talk about more, was just a sort of profound moment in his life story. And then there was the key fact, which is that it became clear to Joe Biden that Barack Obama didn't want him to run for president. He was concerned that it might end in embarrassment for Biden. He thought this might end up being a kind of fizzled end to a long and dignified career. I think the honest answer is also Obama was worried that it would reflect poorly on the administration, and it also might divide the Democratic Party at a moment when it was beginning to face this kind of insurgent threat from Donald Trump. And so Obama, quite explicitly in private with Biden, started to make it clear that he didn't think it was a good idea to run. And in the end, they made the choice. Biden and some of his advisors, one of his advisors, Mike Donilon, that I describe in the book, basically looked at him one day and looked at him and said, "This is a man who is still grieving," and said, "I don't think you should do this." And it was the next day that they went into the Rose Garden and said, "This is over. I can't do it," with Obama by his side. And I think at that point, sure, I definitely thought this thing is over. That's the end of this kind of 5-decade dream of becoming the president. But of course, if there's one thing we've learned about Joe Biden's life, it's that it moves in these totally unpredictable directions. And just one time after another, it has taken these kind of hairpin turns that has led him to today.
You describe it as a 5-decade career in public life. Most political observers think that they knew everything about Joe Biden's career. But in their review in the Washington Post, they said that you, quote, present a picture of the Democratic nominee that is in a few ways unexpected. So what surprised you about Joe Biden?
The interesting thing for me was, and I'll tell you, by the way, the founding idea for this book was, yeah, we think we know Joe Biden. But if somebody took your life or my life and reduced it to, say, the 5 bullet points that people might know about either one of us or about Joe Biden, you would look at that yourself and say, what a ridiculously impoverished portrait. Like, you don't understand my interior life. You don't understand how I made the choices I made or why I made them, or the things that weighed on me, or my insecurities, or the things I only told once or twice to people I really trusted. And I said, that's the story here. If we're trying to have a presidential election partly about character, about who these people really are, not about just the policy issues, not to make light of the policy issues, but really to understand how these two men and their minds work, we have to do a little more work to understand Biden. So that's what led me down that path. And one of the things that surprised me actually was, we often see him as this person who's sort of a little bit of a kind of undisciplined political figure. His staff would describe it. There's a wonderful term that his staff used, which is that when Biden would go, as they said, off prompter, that's when they got nervous, and they would sort of stand up straight when he went free range and began to kind of meander around. But the truth is, a lot of the times that he was doing things, there was a purpose behind it. I mean, one public example we all know is in 2012 when he went on Meet the Press and said that he supported gay marriage before the president did. A lot of people said, oh my God, what a classic Biden moment. He got out in front of the president, womp womp, how could you do that? The truth is, as somebody said to me later, Joe Biden is a nearly perfect weather vane for where the center of the Democratic Party is. And he saw where things were going. And he wasn't going to miss that. And he got there. And he happened to get himself on the right side of history a little bit before Barack Obama did. And Obama forgave him for it, I should say, because he understood the political calculus.
I covered the White House and I was there that day and that week, and I remember the drama. Do you think, was it an intentional nudge? Was he trying to drive Obama to an earlier decision, or he just wanted to be on the right side of that issue himself?
I think of it this way, which is he knew where Obama was going. I mean, they were actively sequencing this thing at the time. They'd already started working on a plan. They were going to have a rollout with a specific kind of interview, a female interviewer. They knew what they were going to do. They were timing this. After all, it was election season. And I think Biden, he never said this to me explicitly, but I get the sense talking to some of the people around him, Biden looked at it. He looked at what the downside risk was. Okay, sure, maybe the president might be a little bit down on me. Sure, some of his advisors would be really pissed. David Plouffe won't be happy. Valerie Jarrett won't be happy. In fact, Valerie Jarrett ended up calling it a betrayal in private. But I think he ran the numbers and he said, our relationship is strong enough to survive this, and it might be a nice thing for a moment. And I think he took it. He saw an opportunity and he took it. And that actually leads to this other thing, which surprised me, which is that he is a little more shrewd, a little cannier politically. That's one of the things the Washington Post was pointing out. It's true, actually. Through this book, I sort of kept gravitating to these moments in which he made choices. And the most relevant one for us now is how it was that this party coalesced around him. Like, why did this happen so fast? He went from being the biggest loser in the race, as you would hear in the press, to being somebody who was on top. And part of the reason was probably how the press handled it, and you and I should talk about that. But also, I think it was, as I talked to people who endorsed him as fast as they did, people like Amy Klobuchar, they said, look, I don't think you guys fully understand that Joe Biden has spent years developing personal relationships with people all over Washington, and they matter. When it comes down to it, they really matter. She said, look, I remember that Biden would call me up after my first speeches in the Senate. These are speeches that I'm giving, at 10 o'clock at night when nobody's around except my mother watching on C-SPAN. And Biden would call me up and say, Amy, that was a great speech. You're going to be a great senator. And he was doing that constantly. And it wasn't insincere. I mean, it was, Bernie Sanders said, the reason I endorsed so fast is, frankly, he said, I had a much better relationship with Joe Biden than I ever had with Hillary Clinton. So that sort of stuff is good politics.
It's interesting because as vice president, he used to say, his job was to build relations with Congress because, he wouldn't say this part, but President Obama wasn't so strong at that. Do you think, projecting forward, that were he to win, is that one of his greater strengths, is that he could try to mend these fences?
I think it's both a strength and it's also a potential vulnerability in an interesting way. I think the strength of it, of course, is he loves the Hill. He kept, interesting, one of the details that I included was that when he was in the vice presidency, he kept his locker in the Senate gym just because he wanted to be able to go over there and basically kibitz with members of the Senate. That is the last thing in the world that Barack Obama would have wanted to do, after all, also a former senator. So there's something that's baked into his vision of himself. I think the reason, and I think that would be a part of his approach to the presidency. The downside is that I think it makes him a little bit subject to his memory of what the Senate was and when it used to function, right? That's the Senate that made Joe Biden. And the question for me, I'd be curious what you make of this, is, does that Senate still exist in any way? Or is he just walking into a dead end by pursuing it that way?
Well, that also gets into sort of the dynamic within the Democratic Party. And there's the progressive wing that would certainly, were he to become president, like him to take a much more combative role in position to the Republicans. And then the centrist wing that wants to see coalition building. I think you argue that one of his strategic strengths is that he understood that the Democratic Party right now is more centrist than the progressive wing likes to think it is. Is that a fair characterization?
It is. And I actually think this was one of those kind of hidden insights that ended up shaping the race much more than we expected. That Biden and his advisors had a view, which was that they understood that people like us in the press tended to gravitate towards the exciting frontier of the party. We were covering AOC. We were writing profiles of the squad. We were writing about Bernie Sanders and the sort of amazing phenomenon that was. And they, the campaign, were pointing to a very different set of data. They said, look here, most Democrats today in 2020 describe themselves as either moderate or conservative Democrats. And that's where the party is. That's where the primary electorate will end up being. And of course, it turned out that they were largely correct. And I think that the problem of that is if they take too much of that lesson, then it leaves them flat-footed when it comes to the next hard problem, which is how do you actually bring the party together? How do you make sure that the left end of the party is actually wants you to succeed? And I'm not sure they've cracked that case yet at all.
Do you have an instinct? My sense is that his instinct is to reach out to build a bipartisan coalition at the expense possibly of progressives. I mean, do you see a governing challenge ahead?
I do. I think he's going to try to have it all, and that may not work. He does see himself, importantly, as a transition candidate. That's his term, right? That's a big idea, actually. I mean, what he says he means is, I want to open a door to the next generation of leadership of the Democratic Party. I think he means that more in terms of racial and ethnic diversity and generational diversity than he really means ideological diversity. But those are not completely inseparable. So he's going to have to figure out a way to bring in meaningful progressive influence into the administration.
Do you see different sort of orientations within his staff? Because I know he has some staff that's been with him forever and they're old Senate hands. And then he's got the new energized younger people who might have a slightly different bent.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really key point. And sometimes we only pay attention to the older staff, let's call them what they are, the Biden guys. They're mostly guys, I jokingly once, occurred to me that they all have the same haircut more or less. And the truth is, that's a problem. That's not how you end up as a government that looks like the country, as Joe Biden likes to say. But he's not, trapped in amber. And this has been an important fact. I mean, a couple of the people who've turned out to be very important in his campaign, somebody like Simone Sanders, who was, after all, a senior Bernie Sanders aide, a young African-American woman who is a real link to the kind of social media world of politics and of where the party is moving. She entered the campaign and became a very influential voice and intervened at key moments, places when he was showing himself to be out of touch. He had a couple of flubs that he said at various points along the way to Black audiences. And she would say to him, no, you cannot let that go. You have to go and clean that up. And that's the kind of advice you don't get if you're operating in an environment in which everybody is more or less in agreement. So part of the challenge is going to be, to what degree is he prepared to be challenged? Mm-hmm. And what worries me is that even intellectually, a president like Barack Obama, who kind of prided himself on this culture of rigorous debate and a kind of, an administration of reason, over time, it just inevitably, the inertia of the presidency, and you know this much better than I do, drives out a culture of debate. And you can end up in a monoculture, and that is politically really diabolical, particularly now.
Some of this speaks to his personality and his character. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to spend time with him? What's your perception of what motivates him and drives him?
What's interesting that people don't get, I think, from seeing him from far away, is that he is like a vacuum cleaner trying to pick up pieces of information that he doesn't know. That's the cliche that we have about him. And there's truth to this, is that the guy doesn't stop talking. Right. But what that misses is that he actually also listens. And there's a very acute example of that somebody mentioned to me in the course of my reporting. They said, look, when I was in the White House with Joe Biden, he would very often ask me to come down the hall and brief him, or I would go down and brief him in his office. So this person would go down, and he said, oftentimes Biden would talk for 90% of the meeting. But then we'd get to the end and he would clap me on the back and say, great meeting. And I'd kind of walk out of there a little bit dazed. But then he always picked something up. He would pick up that meaningful fact, or he'd sift out this important line of some sort of intelligence or analysis, and he would braid it into his framework and how he would talk about things. And I think some of this goes back to who he is, and really back to sort of who he began his life, how he began his life, which was that he was the kid. And I know we sometimes, hear a lot about the stutter, but it is more than a political prop. It is a big deal in understanding his mind and his character. He started life feeling like, as he put it, I was wearing a dunce cap. That's how he says it. He remembers the kids who humiliated him in school, and he remembers the fact that he couldn't speak. And it sort of altered him, because when he broke that, when he mastered this stutter, it gave him a sense that if he worked at it, that he could actually he could beat the doubters, the skeptics. And sometimes he leans in a little too hard at it, and that's how you end up seeing that side of Joe Biden that sometimes, you know, will challenge somebody in the crowd to a push-up contest, or, you know, say he has a higher IQ. It comes from that place. What I think of, I sort of think of it as a productive insecurity, basically.
This goes to something else, which is this public narrative that he is a man very at ease with being vulnerable in public. But something you've talked about before was the challenge he experienced after the death of his wife and child, and that sort of the world forced on him this posture as a grieving public figure, that he was supposed to embrace that. And you say that was at odds with how he perceived himself. That was hard for him.
Yeah, that's a really interesting detail that I didn't know at all about until I was really sort of plunging into this part of his life. He found himself in this unwelcome position. You know, he'd been through a horror, obviously. And you know, interestingly, Jessica, I first reported on Biden before I had kids, and now I have two kids. And it's actually sort of deepened the way I think about what happened to him at that point in his life. And the idea of sort of continuing on and going into the Senate, you know, he considered suicide. I mean, this was as much of a rupture in his imagination of his life as you can imagine. And all of a sudden the press comes to him, and they have a role in mind. Okay, you're going to be the noble grieving widower, you know? And he didn't really want to be the noble grieving widower. In fact, what he and his brother would do is they'd go out into the city and like look to pick fights with people. There was a demon in him. He was full of rage at that point, rage against everything he'd ever learned and believed. I mean, as he said, look, I was raised to believe in a benevolent God, and here a merciful God, and here I am living with something that is completely unexplainable and unbearable. And he hated that role. And yet he also sort of came to understand that there was some value in it, that he could use that, not in a cynical political way, but he could use it to connect with other people. And people started to come to him. It's an odd sensation when you see it in practice. But when Joe Biden is in public, people seek him out because they've had a terrible thing happen to them. They will very often like go for him in a rope line or something, and they will say, my wife died, or I lost a child, or I lost my husband. And in that moment, he stops. He doesn't go on, and he has these encounters with people that are just extraordinary. They have really deep impact on the people he meets. And I think he had to decide whether he was going to do that and sort of be that role or not. And he ended up becoming almost a sort of reluctant pastoral figure in his politics. And he wanted to be Henry Kissinger, the great foreign policy sage. But that's not what history had in mind for him. And he ultimately, slowly embraced what he was.
And then it happened again when Bo died. And I just remember that moment and thinking just how brutal it was, that there's this story that Bo said to him, you have to run, on his deathbed, and then Bo dies. And then Obama says to him, you basically can't run. And it's just like all of this is pulled out from under him at the same time. Can you describe what that period of his life was, or how what residue that left for him?
Yeah, I think it's, for people who don't really know the relationship between Joe Biden and Bo Biden, it's not just father and son. I mean, this was really like, you know, this is a family of extraordinary, intense closeness. David Axelrod told me a story about the first time he ever went to go see Joe Biden when they were vetting him for the vice presidency, still in secret. And he goes to their house in Delaware, and he sees that just a tiny little moment. He noticed that when they parted, when Bo Biden left after having lunch at the house, that Joe Biden kissed him, and Bo kissed him back. And later, Axelrod goes back to Washington, and he says to Barack Obama, he says, look, there's this thing, this family there's something special about this family. And I don't know what it is, but it's not a put on. And I don't quite know how to explain it, but I think it's an asset for us politically and just as an institution, as an administration. So then you get to this terrible event, which is Beau Biden is obviously diagnosed with a brain tumor. He's the Attorney General of Delaware. He's got kids. And for Joe Biden, this was, Beau Biden was not only his namesake and his protege, he was the person that Joe Biden would tell people in private. He would say, Beau has all of my best qualities and none of my worst, which is the kind of self-reflection that you began to hear from Joe Biden. People jokingly called Beau, Biden 2.0. And it just staggered Joe Biden. And I think in an interesting way, somebody said to me who's very close to him, I don't think he would have said this to Joe Biden directly, but it's an important observation. This person said that when Beau died, it killed off the arrogant side of Joe Biden. It changed him physically, just the way he carried himself. There was no longer that college football player piece of him, that kind of aspirational side. And he became a more reflective, a sort of quieter person. I think that is part of what we see today. And to be frank about it, we are a country in mourning right now. I mean, we are a country that is literally grieving. And to see a candidate who has this kind of personal acquaintance with suffering is different than what we usually get in Washington. And I think people on some level, even if we don't really articulate it every day, we read that from him.
It's interesting. I spend my life on social media now, and the things that go viral are these moments where, a differently abled child runs up to Joe Biden and hugs him, and he hugs him back. I mean, or those moments you're describing, this is in a way what people are craving. Do you think in a weird way he's just, I know this sounds corny, but made for this moment?
I do. I mean, look, it's hard to write about Joe Biden as a three-dimensional figure without being a little bit open to the corny side of this, because in a way, he's a rebuttal to some of the cynical side of politics, some of the things that got us a president like Donald Trump, this kind of completely desiccated idea that nobody believes in anything and that nobody's got any goodness in them at all. And so why not just vote for an arsonist to burn the place down? They had this interesting pattern on social media when Biden entered the race that, you would see the usual things would ignite, outrage tweets would ignite. And then they found what the Biden campaign started calling empathy moms. And those were the people who were swapping these messages about Biden in which he was demonstrating basic elements of humanity. And, it would be him kneeling down with a kid to talk to him at eye level, or it was him talking to somebody who stutters. And I do find, there's a risk in getting too kind of swept up in this slightly mawkish version of him. Except that I think that as a country, this is the moment when it matters. Right now we're a lot of us are rethinking the legacy of Jimmy Carter, after all. I mean, there's a new biography of him, not a person who got a second term in office, but a person who carried himself with decency long after the presidency. And if we're trying to really understand the road to now, how did we get into a situation with a Donald Trump in the presidency? I think we have to be a little bit open to the idea that we may have been underweighting some of these other values, some of these other virtues.
Let's talk about the less virtuous side, or some of the press's more critical moments. Before he got the nomination, the coverage of him was a bit, clueless, out of touch, grandpa who doesn't know what's really happening. And then there was the coverage of how he sometimes is slightly inappropriate in the way he interacts with people, which
Sure.
Any political reporter has known for years and kind of discounts as part of the package.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if, you think that the press coverage shifted? I mean, that kind of all went away, at least in the mainstream coverage. How would you rate the coverage of him right now?
Well, I think there's two separate things going on there, and they're both interesting. I mean, the first one is, how did the press handle this question of whether he was being inappropriate in his contacts with women? And I actually thought that at the time the coverage was pretty good, in the sense that it was tough on him. They said, look, for years people have been kind of saying, oh, Joe Biden is the guy who will kind of get too close to you. He's the ultimate close talker. I mean, I wrote about it in 2014. I think I mentioned in my piece that it is true that it's not just women. I mean, he bumped his forehead into mine when we were talking, and that's part of who he is. And I think that Lucy Flores, who was one of the first women to come forward and say, this made me uncomfortable, she also made an important distinction. She said, I'm not saying this is a sexual assault. I'm not saying this is like the women who've accused Donald Trump of sexual assault. And other women came forward and said that they felt that Joe Biden had gotten too close to them. Some of them also said, actually, it never bothered me. But the point was, people treated it as that rather than saying this is all of a piece with what Donald Trump's been accused of. It's important to point out there is a case, Tara Reid, who accused Joe Biden of sexual assault. In that case, reporters did what reporters do. They went out, they looked for confirming evidence. Biden emphatically denied it. It was there for a while, and reporters did not find that next story that would have given it a second life, and it has for the moment died down. But I think the broader question that you also raised, which is how do reporters treat him? I think it's notable to me that we do get locked into our patterns, our caricatures. So, good example, prime example. The other day, he said in an interview, he was giving an answer, and then it sounded, if you wanted to make it sound this way, as if he was thinking he was running against George W. Bush. Well, actually, he was in an interview with somebody named George Lopez, and that's why he said George. But this thing took flight on social media, and we know the rest of the story, and it became a story of its own. But I'd be curious what you make of this. I do look at the coverage right now, and I see some lessons learned from 2016. I think people are a little bit more confident and prudent about not just chasing whatever the latest unverified claim is simply because it's been claimed. But am I being too optimistic?
No, I absolutely agree that, for example, the Hunter Biden coverage, people looked into it and found that the sourcing doesn't hold up. It doesn't connect. And they've learned the lesson of over-reporting Hillary's emails, in my view. And so from that, they've decided to ratchet back and really not amplify that story. I do also think that the media, especially the political press, if you've been in Washington, you know Joe Biden. And so they've known him for so long. It's almost easier for reporters to make their own judgments. I do wonder, there is this question, is he somewhat diminished? And, the press really kind of glosses over that, but it is a healthy, hefty narrative on social media and in the right. And I wonder how you would address that question. Is he diminished?
Well, you also hear it from the left. I mean, interestingly, at one point during the primary, Jill Stein started tweeting about hashtag Biden cognitive decline, and it managed to push it up into one of the trending tweets. This was an excellent bit of analysis by Renee DiResta at Stanford. So, he was getting sort of hit on both sides with that. If I've learned anything in this year, it's that I tend to defer to doctors rather than politicians or political writers on issues of health. And on this, his physicians are clear. They say that Joe Biden is, and I'm quoting here, a healthy, vigorous man of his age. Now, his age is 77. He's not 37. Right. But I will tell you, this is not a defense of him. This is a description, which is that I've interviewed this guy off and on since 2014. Today, he is thinner. He's a little more hoarse. He is obviously a little slower when he walks across the stage. And yet his mind is unchanged. I mean, if you have a conversation with the guy, he doesn't sound different today than he would have if you had a conversation with him a few years ago. So look, James Comey once wrote of Biden in the White House that his conversations often began, as he put it, at direction A, and they ended sharply at direction Z. So this is not a new fact. And I think part of this is that there are people just tuning into Biden now who didn't know that 20 years ago, people were saying that Biden sure does talk in ways that don't resemble ordinary conversation.
I went to a lot of his speeches and rallies in 2008. Play the tape. It's all there, right?
You have receipts. You have receipts.
We have receipts. You mentioned when we first started talking that one of the things that first got you hooked on covering Biden was foreign policy and his engagement there. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about his worldview. It's been said that he's almost a counter indicator on foreign policy. If he's for something, or against something, it's always the wrong direction. Do you think that that's a fair characterization? And what is your view of his perception of America's role in the world?
Yeah, that critique was put most acutely by, you'll remember, Bob Gates, who was, after all, Obama's Secretary of Defense. And he's the one who said Biden's been wrong on every foreign policy question. And that's what sent me to really go and try to check that out a little bit. And there's some history there. I mean, part of the reason why Bob Gates feels that way is because Biden said about Bob Gates, he wouldn't support him to be CIA director because Bob Gates had been a Kremlinologist at the CIA who did not correctly predict the fall of the Soviet Union. I raised that only to say nothing bad about Bob Gates, an incredibly decent public service and servant, but to say that if you've spent that long in government, you will have, as Richard Haas said to me at one point, you will have your hits and you will have your misses. Nobody bats 1,000 and nobody bats 0, to use an LA analogy today. And please don't get all self-satisfied about baseball. But my point being, Joe Biden has been involved in foreign affairs in a very deep way for a very long time. And the reason why I think that matters, somebody at one point said to me in my reporting, you can drop Joe Biden into just about any capital in the world, and he will know some Joe Blow, either a socialist or a fascist or somebody in between. He just has literally encountered these people and these problems. He knows the lay of the land. And I think what we've seen over the course of the last 4 years is that it sure is possible to come into office with no experience in foreign affairs, but you're only going to succeed if you're willing to read, if you're willing to actually pay attention to the details, if you're willing to train up on these kinds of complexities. And Joe Biden comes in with a pretty deep knowledge, a pretty deep reservoir of understanding of this country. Now, I think the challenge for him, to the second part of your question, is his conception of America's role in the world updated to where we are? Because some of his muscle memory is when we were the exceptional nation that could go anywhere it wanted and in effect project its values, whether people wanted it or not. That's not the world we live in now. And one of the things he'll be contending with, I think, is a world in which you have particularly China, but the US and China and the rest of the world in a much more, I would say, sort of ungoverned arrangement where each one is asserting its values and they have to make a case for it. And that's one of the reasons why he ends up making this argument that it's time for the United States to go out and make a case for the free world again. I think that's one of the things you're likely to see from him if he becomes president.
One of the things I always tell people when they ask me, what would Biden presidency be? He has had some staff with him, as you mentioned, for many, many years. And I imagine that I think that they are some of the best staff in Washington. He has an ability to pick really good people. Is it your sense there are certain people who would drive his foreign policy who have been with him as well for years?
Yeah, no, it's a great point too. Also a bit about him. He does have this, this is sort of a known thing in Washington. He has this ability to sort of find people who are nobodies, but are just smart. Yeah. And they don't have any background, they don't have any connections, and he'll pull this person up and give them a lot of responsibility, and off they go, and they become some of the most powerful, really sort of successful people who have been in Democratic administrations. You see a really interesting thing happening among his foreign policy advisors. Take somebody like Jake Sullivan. Jake, was obviously important in Hillary Clinton's orbit. He worked on the campaign, worked for the State Department. And Jake is one of the people today who is saying we need to update our idea of the United States. Meaning we can't just go out into the world and assume that everybody's going to line up with us. That's not the world as it is right now. We've lost a tremendous amount of credibility, and we have to begin to rebuild that trust. And the way you do that fundamentally is by recommitting yourself to these alliances. And that, I think, it's in some ways it's diplomacy 101, and it's one of the things that I think you would begin to see as an immediate contrast with the Trump administration is the U.S. going out and saying, look, we're friends and we're trustworthy and you should be with us. So I suspect that's sort of the face of the foreign policy challenge to begin with.
One of the central messages and promises of his campaign is that he'll unify America. Now, you've both characterized him as somebody who's more strategic than we given credit for in the public narrative, but also somebody who's wedded to this old notion of what Washington used to be like. Do you think it's possible to unify us? And would he be willing to do what it takes, even if it's not working with the other side? Does he have the toughness and sort of fortitude right now to make the hard decisions that would sort of make policy in Washington under impossible circumstances?
That's the crucial question. It's sort of the $1 million question is, he says he wants to now be transformative in the spirit of FDR, but FDR wasn't dealing with a hostile political atmosphere of the kind that Joe Biden would be if he comes in. But I think there's something really important to remember, which is, he has essentially two tools, as some of his advisors have put it to me. He wants comedy and goodwill. He wants to go for unity. But if that doesn't work, he'll go for scorched earth. That's the term that somebody used. Look, he knows there's a reason why he's the last guy at the dance here today. He made it because he understands how government works. He understands how politics works. If it means getting rid of the filibuster, I think you would see him do that. He can't talk about it now, but I don't think there's much of a doubt that that's where he would get. But I think there's another piece of this that actually we don't talk enough about, and that's the fact that very often it's not the most progressive presidents who achieved the most progressive legislation. It was not Kennedy, after all, but LBJ who achieved the Great Society. As somebody in Biden's campaign said to me, I think it was Ron Klain, said, look, Biden may not be the hippest, wokest guy in the room, neither was LBJ, but the truth is that's what it takes to actually forge hard, concrete solutions. Nixon, after all, created the EPA. And that's not me talking. That's actually a progressive activist who reminded me of that. So the goal is now, how do you figure out how to sell ideas in a sort of moderate language, but are in fact transformative, substantive ideas? And he won't be the first person to try. And I think he actually has a decent shot at doing it.
Evan, you're fascinating. I could talk to you all day. I feel that I'm hoarding your time, and I should let Andrea ask some audience questions. I think this is probably the right moment to do that. Yes? Hi.
Hi there. I'm back. So I do have a bunch of questions from the audience. This is an interesting one. Do you think that Joe takes support from the Black community for granted?
I think there's a lot of concern out there that he does. He said a couple of things along the way that made people feel as if he was just assuming that he would get Black support. And that would be a costly mistake on his part. I will say, if you're trying to understand, I'm not going to defend him or indict him for it. What I will say is, if you're trying to understand how he sees it, the way he sees it is that at the core of his whole political life, he imagines himself as being somebody who got in this in the spirit of civil rights. I mean, that's one of the things that was in his initial campaign for office back in 1972 when he ran for the Senate. So he's, in a way, oftentimes when he says something that sounds like he is taking Black voters for granted, it's partly because he's sort of getting a little too comfortable, getting a little too familiar. He sees him, like, I think the pride of his life is that he was the vice president to the first African-American president. It makes him proud beyond belief. And sometimes he forgets that that means that he can't be as familiar as he might want to be. And that's what gets him into trouble. But I think that as a pure political matter, it would be a hard case to make that a Trump presidency, that a second Trump term would be of greater advantage to African Americans than a Biden term. But he has to make that case. And he has to keep making it every day, I think, through November 3rd.
So would his huge, this miracle that happened through Clyburn, right? I mean, was it because of Clyburn? Could he have done it without Clyburn?
No, he couldn't have. I think the Clyburn intervention, when the history of this race is written, is going to be a chapter of its own. And I spoke to Clyburn about it, actually, for the book. I found it just immensely interesting. What Clyburn said was, look, you have to remember that the same week, if not this, maybe the same month that Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president in 2016, a racist madman walked into a church and slaughtered people as they worshiped. For us, the question of a president is not an abstract question of, who's the most dynamic guy on social media, who's the most popular person in New York or Silicon Valley. This is, as Cornell William Brooks, who's a great civil rights activist who's from South Carolina, said to me, he said, voters in South Carolina like me are, as he put it, unapologetically pragmatic, by which he meant we don't have the luxury of not taking this incredibly seriously. And there may be other candidates who are more exciting, have a policy idea that we find more enchanting. But as somebody who we think can win and decisively beat this president, that person is Joe Biden. And that's what Jim Clyburn said when he went out on that stage at that truly fateful day and delivered this emphatic endorsement. What he said was, I fear for the future of my children in a way I never have, and my children's children. And we know Joe, and more importantly, he said, Joe knows us. And I think that was an idea that was running through, especially older African-American voters. I wouldn't say the same necessarily about younger voters, but that was a key piece of the puzzle.
So in the same vein, lots of questions like this, but this is touching on something similar. It's not like Biden was a huge civil rights activist and he admits it with regret.
Yeah.
So what then is the real source of Biden's support from the Black community? Is it just because he was Obama's vice president?
I think that's a pretty big piece of it, is the honest answer. I mean, I think what people saw, all of us, white or Black, or anything else, what we saw for 8 years was Biden doing his level best to try to help this president succeed. And that was partly from the very earliest moments of their partnership. I mean, David Axelrod put it to me, he said, look, the truth is Biden got the nod to be vice president, partly because he was helpful to us culturally and geographically. He could speak to voters in parts of the country who might not be naturally at home with Barack Obama. And that was in service of Barack Obama's success. And what you saw in that, and anybody can recognize that look on Joe Biden's face when he watched Obama achieve the great important moments of his administration, whether it was Obamacare, whether it was advancing other moments of social progress, he felt like he was a part of history. I think one of the interesting things that I've seen from Biden over the years was he once went to Selma on the anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And he said something that sort of surprised me. He said, look, I played a bit part in some desegregation protests. I'm paraphrasing this part. He said, I played a bit part in some desegregation protests in Delaware, but I wasn't here. And I should have been here. And I'm sorry I wasn't here. And I apologize for not doing more. I think there's a kind of self-reflection there that you don't always hear from people at his stage in politics. And it speaks to something deeper.
I don't think you hear it at all. I mean, here's another one. Biden makes much of his middle-class roots. Have you ever sensed a defensiveness about his regular Joe demeanor, or his not being a billionaire, real or not, or his lack of elite education?
Yep, there's a lot of defensiveness there, actually. I mean, in an interesting, I find it probably productive more than destructive, in the sense that, look, there was a famous moment in the '88 campaign when he was feeling under attack. He had just been found out that he had stolen words from Neil Kinnock, the British politician, in a speech. And he lashed out at a voter at a rally, and he said, look, I probably have a higher IQ than you do. I graduated in the top half of my class. And that wasn't true. He didn't graduate in the top half of his class. And the point was that he's insecure about it. The truth is he's the first, as we know, first Democratic nominee since Walter Mondale not to have gotten an Ivy League education. And here he is surrounded in sort of Obama land and Clinton land, where there's Rhodes Scholars everywhere you turn, and everybody's constantly throwing their graduate degrees at you. And here's Joe Biden, and he's never been welcomed into that club. And it gnawed at him a little bit. And I actually think as he's gotten to this point in his life, he's much more at peace with it than he was before. In a way, his record speaks for itself. You hear him now using that line on the campaign trail about not having gone to an Ivy League school. He's kind of owning it. He's proud of it. I think the basic fact of his political life is the Scranton Joe thing is not a put on. I mean, he was as we know, he was the poorest member of the Senate for a long time. Mm-hmm. He's not in this. He didn't get in this for the money. He's gotten rich since leaving office. That's not a mystery. And frankly, just about everybody else who's left the presidency and the vice presidency has gotten rich. But he didn't get in this for that. That's not what he's about. And he still is much more at home, frankly, in a union hall, I think, than he is in a lot of other places. That really is to the core of his candidacy. I'll tell you one more thing on that I just find interesting. And back when I was interviewing him at one point in the White House, this is before Bernie Sanders was on the scene as a presidential candidate. This whole Sanders phenomenon had not yet begun. And Biden went off on this long riff about how he thought that the Democratic Party was failing working class Americans, that it was it had become too interested in money and in sort of servicing the elite. And I, at the time, didn't get it. This is my own mistake. I didn't quote it. I didn't even quote it in a piece because I thought, what's he really talking about? And of course, he was picking up on something very important in the shape of politics to come. And he was right, and I was wrong.
One more question, I think, and Jessica, jump in at any time too. Or after this question, when Biden improvises at the microphone, accidents can happen, as you know, we know. Do you think he'll rein himself in if he's elected, or not? What do you think he'll do?
I don't think there's that much reining in that can be done. I think it's baked in. And sometimes he says things that he doesn't usually say things that are intended to offend. Let's be honest. I mean, there was one famous moment when he was kind of swept up in a crowd and he sees a state senator there that he's really admiring of, and he says, "Get on your feet." It turns out the guy was in a wheelchair, and he goes, and Biden says, "Oh God, love you. What the hell am I saying?" And it was one of those moments where you just thought, what I love about this is this was the entire interior monologue out loud. And I think after a presidency of, let's call it what it is, a pattern of unrelenting deception, having somebody who can probably do a pretty bad job of hiding from us what he really thinks would be an improvement. So I'm not counting on him reining it in all that much.
Jessica, do you have a last question you want to?
I'm curious, I don't know if you know this, but do you know the real nature of his relationship with Kamala Harris and how they mended fences, or how effectively?
I don't have all that much that other people haven't already reported. I looked into it and I found it interesting for one reason, but I'd welcome your thoughts on it. My sense is that, look, we all remember that fateful moment on the debate stage when it looked like, well, that's the end of the Kamala Harris-Joe Biden friendship, when she criticized him for his policy on court-ordered busing. And there were a lot of people, particularly around Biden. There was some scars left, particularly with his sister and with Jill Biden. But Biden, I think gets to who he is as a politician, and particularly his senatorial mindset, which is you can have a drag-out fight on a Monday, but on Tuesday, we're not going to linger on what those were. We're going to talk about how we can actually do something meaningful together. I think that's part of the reason why, look, we all know the political reasons. There are a lot of reasons why he went for Kamala Harris, but I think he was willing to put that behind them. And that speaks to how he approaches politics. It doesn't have to be blood sport. It can, in fact, be the basis for something productive. And that's how I interpret it.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming today, because it was such an enlightening program and so good. And here are these terrific books. They're so great. Go to the website, go to the link to the bookstore. Thank you again. And we'll see you really soon. Jessica, it's such a pleasure to see you back at Writer's Block. And Evan, we'll see you in the New Yorker.
Thanks to you both. Thank you, Jessica, so much. Thanks, Andrew. That was a thrill. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, and see all of you soon. Bye-bye.